You know, the funny thing about knitting is that it looks so much easier when somebody else is doing it. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. I remember my first project was a total disaster. It was so bad that I quit knitting for like 3 or 4 years. So if you're still kind of new to knitting and you're more frustrated than you are enjoying the process, you're in the right place, because you don't know what you don't know, and that's what I want to help you with today. So today I want to share several of the things that I wish I knew then, because I ultimately wouldn't have given up knitting in the first place. So going back to that first really failed project, I'm thinking about the things that I wish I would have known then that would have saved me, but that also are very relatable and helpful for you. So the first thing that I didn't know is that your work grows considerably. And the reason why that was such an issue for me is because, well, one, I wasn't following a pattern. I just wanted to knit a simple garter stitch blanket for my nephew, and I was basing that off of a measurement. But then after I knit a couple of rows, I noticed it was way longer than when I started. So if you find yourself in a similar situation, just know that your cast on will be a lot shorter, or noticeably shorter, than what it'll be after you knit up a few rows. So not only did I struggle because my cast on grew so much that it was so much longer than my needles, well, the other thing that I wish I would have known then is that you need circular needles for bigger projects. So I bought a pair of 12-inch straight knitting needles because I didn't know this, and I thought that I could knit an entire blanket with a 12-inch pair of circular needles. Now I think the name can be a little bit confusing for new knitters. Circulars, it makes it seem like you can only knit in the round on them, which is true. You can knit rounds with circular needles, but you can also knit flat pieces, so just straight back and forth rows. And actually, if you ever want to knit a baby blanket or a regular blanket, then you will need a pair of circular needles because you need that long cord. You need the entire width of the project to be on the needle at the same time. And really the only way to accomplish that is to have something with a cord or a circular needle. So if you plan on knitting a blanket or something that's wider than what you could fit on a 12 or a 14-inch straight needle, then get a fixed circular needle. It's something that's really cheap, probably doesn't cost more than a straight pair of needles, but it has a cord on it that you can knit that long project and see if you like knitting in the first place. Now this one isn't necessarily a lesson that I learned the hard way in that first project because I followed the yarn label for this one, but this is a question that I see over and over from beginners. Well, I see that the pattern recommends this needle size, but I only have this one. Can I use this one instead? And for this, I would say you really should try to get the needle size that your pattern recommends. I don't want to go down a big, long, confusing rabbit hole, but the size of the needle that you use really does matter, especially for projects where it needs to fit specifically. So if you're knitting a hat, or you're knitting a sweater, or anything else that you're going to wear, I know I said I was going to try to avoid a confusing rabbit hole, but this is a topic it's not generally straightforward to explain. But in a nutshell, your needle size determines your stitch size. And if you use a different size than what your pattern recommends, because it's the only size you have, well, your stitches are going to be a different size. And so that project is either going to be too small or too big. And for a blanket or a scarf, you know, that's really not that big of a deal because if it's kind of big or kind of small, it'll still function. But if you're knitting a hat or you're knitting like a pair of maybe hand warmers or a sweater or something like that, where it does have to fit a specific way, that's when you'll run into issues. So I think just as a general rule of thumb, if you start a pattern and you don't have the right needle size for it, I would say either do what you can to obtain that needle size, or maybe just put that project aside until you do have the right needle size. You know, another one of those things that I wish I would have known for that first project especially is that lot numbers matter most of the time. It's one of those things that I completely swept this under the rug. I didn't think it was a big deal at all until it was a big deal. And then I wish I would have listened when somebody told me that you should buy all of the same lot number for one project. The yarn that I bought for that blanket had a lot number on it. Well, first of all, I didn't know that you needed more than one skein of yarn to knit an entire blanket. But I also didn't want to spend a ton of money on this blanket yet because I didn't know if it was actually going to work. So I just bought one skein, ignoring the fact that it had a lot number on there. And then later on, when I used that same yarn to crochet a blanket, and I bought more skeins from, you know, the same store, all different lot numbers, you can tell that there are 4 distinct stripes to that blanket because the lot numbers were different. It's not so noticeable that you can look at one skein when you buy it and say, oh yeah, this is a different color. No, it's so subtle that you only notice it when they're right next to each other. At least that's how it was for this yarn. So yeah, if you look at your yarn label and you notice that there is a lot number on there, do buy as many skeins as you need to finish that project in the same lot number. Because if you don't, there's really no guarantee that those colors are going to match, and you'll probably see it in the end project. The first few projects that I ever completed, I found myself wanting to rush through them because I wanted to have that finished project in my hand. I wanted that excitement of having a new hat or whatever that I made with my bare hands and that I could use. What I realized though is after finishing a few projects, some of that excitement wears off a little bit. And what I found is that the stitches that happen between the start to finish are really what makes me happy and is really the reason why I knit. So it's very much the journey is the destination, or however that saying goes. For knitting, I think you'll find that the joy and the relaxation and all of the benefits that you'll get from knitting will happen in every stitch of that project. And really, in the grand scheme of things, the excitement that you feel at the end is really just a fraction of how fun that entire project was for you. So if you find yourself wanting to rush through a project because you want that excitement of having a finished project, I completely get it, but just enjoy the process too. I think that's far more rewarding overall than just the finishing part of that project. That baby blanket that I tried to knit for my nephew was just one disaster after the next. And because I didn't know how to fix mistakes, I would rip it out and start over. Made a mistake, couldn't accept the fact that there was a mistake there, then I ripped it out and started over, and then made a mistake again, ripped it out, started over, knitted up however many rows again. I went back and forth like this so many times that I drove myself away from knitting. I think if you take nothing away from this video, it's this one. That mistakes happen. You will start a project and you will drop a stitch or twist a stitch or something. Something is going to go wrong. And this is still something that I struggle with today. Even though I know this, that mistakes happen and you have to embrace the imperfection in something that's handmade. The little imperfections will make you better every single project you finish. So just recognize that they're going to happen. They're going to be there in pretty much every project, and that's okay because every mistake that you make will just make your knitting better and better the next time around. I know it's really exciting to learn how to knit and pick out a project that you're really excited to make and start on that first. If you've never knit anything before, resist the urge to make a project first. It's totally fine if you want to find a project and be really excited about that and work towards that. But the best thing that you can do for yourself, at least in the long term, is to knit a few swatches first. Now that's not the most interesting thing to knit, but making a garter stitch swatch and making a stockinette stitch swatch, just a little tiny piece of fabric that you can practice your stitches, that is the best thing you can do for yourself as a beginner. Just by knitting a couple of swatches first, you can work out a lot of kinks. That way, when you do finish your project, the one that you have been really excited about, it will look better and you'll be more excited and you'll be more likely to start another project. Now we talked about gauge really briefly before, and I'm bringing it up again because it is a very important topic. But don't stress about gauge too much as a brand new knitter. Here's what I would do. If you're just starting out, pick projects where gauge isn't nearly as important. So knitting a scarf, or knitting a blanket, or knitting a placemat for your table, or a table runner, or a pillow to some degree. Basically pick projects where the size isn't crucial to how that thing is going to function. Because gauge and size go hand in hand. And in order to knit something from a pattern that fits you in a specific way, you have to have a handle on gauge, what it is, how to change it, all the little quirks that come with it. And as a beginner knitter, you don't need to worry about that. You need to know that it's there and it exists and it is a topic that you should pay attention to later on, but not until you're really comfortable working your basics and you finished a couple of projects. Now this might be something that you don't want to hear, but I think it's something that you need to hear. Your first project will look awful. Even if you've knit a couple of swatches first, the first thing that you finish will not be your proudest work. But it should be, because it is your first finished piece, and that's a huge accomplishment. And as tempted as you will be to throw it in the trash and never let anybody see it, keep it. Tuck it away in a drawer somewhere. In like a year, come back to it like a little knitting time capsule, and you will look back fondly on that wonky, bumpy, weird-looking project, those first swatches that you knit. It'll be a really fun experience. So just know that the first few things that you finish won't be your proudest work, although you should be proud of them because you finished them. So probably the greatest thing about knitting is you really don't need a ton of stuff to knit. You really only need some yarn, a pair of needles that you really like, a pair of scissors, and a yarn needle. And that can get you through 95% of the projects you'll ever knit. However, even though you only need those few things, you will be tempted to buy everything. I don't know, when you walk into a craft store, there are so many fun little gadgets. And while some of them might be very useful, at its core, you really only need those few fundamentals. But you will be tempted to buy all of the yarn and all of the needles, and that's totally normal. Now, if you have any desire whatsoever to make your own clothing, I think you're in the perfect spot because, in my opinion, for whatever that's worth, I think knitting is the better craft for making clothing. Now, don't get me wrong, I am the crochet lady. I've got the crochet channel and I love crochet very much, but there's just something about knitted fabric that just lays so perfectly for something like a sweater. Not that you can't make really beautiful clothing with your crochet hook. I just think it's maybe a tiny bit easier with knitting needles. Wherever you are in your knitting journey, if you find that you're struggling, you can't finish a project, you can't not make mistakes, or you're just not happy with how things look, or you can't get it to feel natural in your hands, or you can't seem to figure out how to identify stitches and all of that, try crochet. I know, it's wild. I'm gonna send you down another rabbit hole here, but honestly, when I had all of the same issues with knitting that you're probably experiencing right now, I turned to crochet. And the only reason why I think I was able to pick up my needles and learn it the second time is because I had some previous knowledge from crocheting. I don't know, there's just something about crocheting first that for whatever reason makes knitting and learning how to knit so much easier. So yeah, if you don't know who I am, if this is the only channel that you follow, I am one of the crochet ladies here on YouTube. I actually have a YouTube channel called B.Hooked Crochet, and that channel is much bigger than this one. I love teaching people how to crochet, and so perhaps you might try that next. I have all sorts of free resources on crochet, on knitting, on my website, on both of these YouTube channels. It's all totally free. I'll link a bunch of those resources below to help you get started. Otherwise, no matter where you are in your knitting journey, if there's something that you learned after the fact that you wish you knew at the beginning, share that in the comments. I think that'll be really helpful for others. All right, happy knitting, and I'll see you in the next one.